welcome to the testing talk. Before I start, I have to admit the test coverage of my project is rather poor, except they are open source GitHub projects because they are lots of fun. So sometimes they are almost 100%, but it's never the case in my commercial projects. So there's a huge difference between a conference and real life. So I would like to talk a little bit about real life, what happens in my project and why it happens. Just the references, I'm on Twitter, and I give from time to time workshop at Munich Airport. So I have fresh t-shirts. If you ask me a good question, you get one of this. So ask questions. I like questions in my talks. And wrote some books, I think some tests here. And these are the workshops. And let's start with the boring stuff. And this is some slides. The problem with the testing, the most frequent asked questions about testing doesn't make any sense. For instance, I get questions a lot, how do you test EJBs with unit tests? Or how to test, I don't know, CDI with unit test. It doesn't make any sense because a unit test shouldn't care whether there's an EJB or CDI. So it doesn't make really any sense. And how it's defined in Wikipedia is, this is actually supposed to be bold, a unit as the smallest testable part of an application. The smallest testable part of an application is a method. I'll show you code a little bit afterwards. So I would first define, the set up the stage and define the terms, and then show you the code. A good news for you, hopefully. Before the show, I created a Maven artifact, which is open, so you can download it, and it comes with whatever I show you here. So it will install and should run on Java 7, Java 8, so white flag, glassfish, and everything else. Okay, if it is a unit, what is the smallest testable part of an application? It's actually a method. So if you have an EJB and you would like to unit test the EJB, you're actually supposed to unit test the method of an EJB. So my answer is, what is actually the correct answer, how to test the EJBs, is that there is no difference to testing POJOs. So if you look at my unit test of a JavaEE application, there is no difference between a unit test for Swing than a unit test for JavaEE. So this question does not make any sense to me, but is asked a lot. And interestingly, in the workshops, is asked a lot on the first day, but never ever asked later. This is like, like magic, like modularization, which I had, there's a completely different talk, how to modularize an application. If you explain how it works, no one asks it again. Questions about this should be obvious. So what EJB is a POJO with at stateless. So how to test an EJB? You should be able to load a class. So what do you need? JavaEE API or EJB API. You need a single annotation with the name stateless. This is the requirement to test an EJB. Now the question, why my projects have so poor code coverage? And what we do in my commercial projects, we only test stuff which is complex. So actually, from my perspective, it's wrong to test getters and setters. It happens a lot in commercial projects because I don't know whether in UK there are also so many crazy architects and QA departments as in Germany. So in Germany, they do not expect software quality, they expect code coverage. And the easiest possible way to increase the code coverage is to test invocable methods. Then your code coverage is great, but nothing is tested. So in my projects, what we test, we increase this, we measure with, for instance, SonarQube or SonarSource is the easiest one, the cyclomatic complexity of a method. If it's greater than 3, it means if else else, 3 execution path, then we write a test. If it's lower than this, the developers and me, I'm a developer, architect, whatever, we are not allowed to write a test for a getter and setter. Because as you can imagine, I never saw getter or setter fail. It's impossible. I mean, for 20 years I do Java or 15 years, whatever, from JDK 1.0, it never failed. Whatever you're doing, and I say, yeah, but sometimes you could do something in the get and setter. Yes, but there's no more get and setter. By definition, get and setter is just a get and setter. Everyone agreed with this? So there's actually no discussion. Don't ask me ever again how to test, unit test, EJBs or CDI. This question doesn't make any sense. Even JPA objects. So how to test a JPA entity would mean if the entity is an anemic one, just getters and setters, no business logic, no tests. No unit tests. If the entity, integration test is the next slide, right? So if the entity contains some business logic, then it's just a regular POJO test. And if you are starting application server with whatever tools you have, aliens, Archilians, whatever, is in my eyes a defect. Why does defect? Because you will spend whole night to watch, getters and setters get tested, which I see a lot in our projects. And I've asked, what do you are doing this? no answer, what do I actually mean? Homework, look at cargo cult programming. It's like you're doing something without knowing why. Okay? Questions about this? Please ask me now. Any questions? No? Integration tests. The next part. So I will show you source code a little bit later. So after this slides, no questions about, oh, you are allowed to ask questions about integration testing because, first, this is the most, I stolen all the definitions from Wikipedia, of course. So this is one-to-one from Wikipedia. And after testing individual classes, so what means integration tests come after unit tests, period. So now you can ask me how to integration test EJBs, or CDI, or JMS, or JPA. I would ask you back, what would you like to test? Are you testing the container or your app? And sometimes the developers just would like to fire off embedded container and see whether the app is running. What you actually tested is, you tested whether the embedded container is able to run your application. What you didn't test is whether the actual container is able to execute the application. What you should know, the embedded containers are not the real one. They look like, but they don't have to behave the same. There's different class loading, different setup, everything is different. And they are slow. Okay? So integration tests, what I do integration tests in JPA, for each JPA object, I write a simple test which just fire off the JPA objects, and I see whether the mapping actually works, whether the queries are working. So I write for myself integration tests for JPA to save time. Because otherwise, what's the option? Deploy everything and wait until you arrive at a website, JSF page or whatever, where the JPA is actually loaded. So I will spend a lot of time in clicking in the view, which I'm too lazy. So what I do up front always, I always write an integration test per JPA object, which is stupid. It just reads and merges the JPA object. And my expectation is, do I misspell anything, right? Because what is my common error, my personal error is, for instance, using SQL words as attribute names. Okay? Questions about this? And this is actually never done, surprisingly. What people attempt to do is the second most frequent asked question. It was asked a lot in Glassfish community, how to test persistence or how to set up embedded Glassfish with persistence. And it's like, why? I never need it. So why you need Glassfish to test persistent? No idea. So what you can do, you can fire up, I show you the source code a little bit later, single liner, persistence, create entity manager factory, create entity manager, it's one liner, and you can start your JPA environment, whether it is OpenJPA, Eclipse Link, or Hibernate, outside the application server. In my eyes, it doesn't make any sense to start the whole application server just to test the JPA. But it's done a lot. And I've asked why, no answer. So really, I never got an answer. So if you know the reason, drop me a mail, because I see a lot in a project, and then developers complain, Java Enterprise is too slow, and deploys, we have to move to Ruby or whatever to make it faster. It's like, no, or just be reasonable. Think about what you actually would like to test, and test only this, and that's the whole world. Agreed? So, okay. So, for EJBs or CDI, in my eyes, integration testing doesn't make any sense, because what you would just test, whether the dependency injection is working. If you don't using interfaces and qualifiers, just add inject, which happens a lot in my projects. So enterprise is a lot simpler than you would expect. It's just inject, inject, inject without any crazy frameworks, how it should be, right? So then it will work. When I need integration tests and something like Archillion, I show you also on source code, is if your business logic heavily depends on CDI, for instance. When it is the case, it is rarely the case in enterprise projects, and often the case in products. As when we have to load plugins, for instance, or extensions, where we have to implement, something like, I just created a logger as an example. I would like to inject and configure a logger. So there's actually no way to test it with unit tests, because whatever I will do, if I will mock out the CDI, it will work. If I will mock out my logger, it will also work. What I have to do is see whether my logger works in conjunction with Weld applications or whatever. So what means I use Archillion exactly for this, for such cases, and they are rare in enterprise projects and more common in enterprise products, where we're building content management system, whatever, which is suited for more than one environment. There's something configurable, some moving parts. In typical boring enterprise projects, there's class, and you are fetching the data from database. If there is no variations, we have actually no embedded container tests. And I have to say 80% of my projects don't use Archillion at all, because there is no added value. The other 20% couldn't be tested well without Archillion. So Archillion is the only possibility to increase the quality. So this is, and what I see more and more, like Archillion is being the silver bullet, which is actually nice, but it costs a lot of performance. You can execute, I would say, thousands of unit tests in seconds, but you will never ever be able to execute 1,000 integration tests created with Archillion in a few minutes, because you have to build the whole container in between. Everyone agreed? Impossible. I have to give away the t-shirts. They are too heavy for the airplane. So, ask questions.
Yeah, I have one.
Very good.
Do you agree that using Archillion for achieving server compatibility, like using Wildfly or making sure that your application runs on Wildfly or Glassfish or any other container, is a good use case, or do you think that Archillion is an overkill for that?
Yes and no, because first what I can do, I can very easily run the application in multiple, like a smoke testing, right? So I can run on Wildfire, Archillion, and Tommy, just swapping the profile. So I can move the dependency of the embedded server to something else. And somehow, what we did is really a JPA. So we had a crazy complex rich domain object model, and we wanted to test it at the same time, whether it runs on Eclipse Link, Hibernate, and OpenJPA. This was perfect. Because you can fire up Archillion and say, okay, swap this and this and this. And this was actually a good thing to use it. And why it's not that good? Because remote test, yes, embedded test, no. Because this is actually system testing, what I really believe is in full application server test. So I set up the application server with full configuration, how it should look like in production, and this is my real test. And I personally don't believe in embedded containers a lot. It's a great help, but this is not, we have strange errors which only happens in production. And to minimize there is a cost saving. And I think all unit and integration tests are testing the business logic, which actually is easy to find if something goes wrong. Yeah? Needless to say that most commercial applications are not very well tested. I think if you introduce something, it's already perfect. Yeah? Okay? Agreed with this? So embedded application server, no. If you're using remote APIs of...
Archillion also supports the remote.
Yeah, the remote one would be better. But then, and right now, I'm using Glassfish, Tommy, and really on my server, Glassfish, Tommy, and Whitefly. And Whitefly and Glassfish have remote API, and this is single liner. So I would rather use a shell script later for system tests to really deploy it how my production or operations would deploy over the command line interface. And Archillion is not a replacement of system testing. This is the point. Okay, it shouldn't be a replacement of system testing. You can do it, but it's not a replacement. This is my personal opinion. It's not like I'm a testing guru. I actually don't care about tests at all. It's just I have to test sometimes in my application. This is what I saw actually, and this is why I expect some conversation. You get a T-shirt, but you have, I think, a shrink a bit because it's medium. So I thought medium is fair, but it's good work. System testing. This is what I like a lot, system tests. This is actually system tests. What they do, it could be called black box testing. This is what I always do, and what it means is most of my Java 6 or Java 7 applications, actually all, have REST APIs nowadays, because you need it, for AngularJS, for whatever. You need some REST endpoints. And I just write JAX-RS client, JAX-RS 2.0. Even for older applications, you can still use JAX-RS 2.0. This is a secret tip, which is not secret at all, because you can load the JAX-RS 2.0 client even for an older app, or you can even misuse JAX-RS 2.0 client for PHP testing or whatever. Doesn't even have to be Java. And then could be Archillion also useful with Graphene. It's a different story. So, but this. And what I'm doing, I'm just accessing the application server from outside using my REST API. And by the way, if you're doing this, it will also improve the quality of the RESTful web service, because think, in this case, it makes a perfect sense what is called the buzzword test-driven design. Because you are forced to use your own API from outside and see whether they are actually usable, intuitive, and self-contained. Okay? So you will see in most of my open source project which ends with ST ends with system test, And what ST is just plain Maven Java project, which only contains test, source test Java, and plain unit tests, which access, using JAX-RS, the deployed application server. Agreed? And this is mostly lacking. Why? Because this does not improve the code coverage, at least not in Germany. Okay, so we don't need this because doesn't change our metrics. Like, who cares about your metrics? Yeah. Okay. Questions? System tests. If you have SOAP, use SOAP, whatever. Access your application from outside. If you have GSF or something, what we would do as a common hack, I would implement a very simple servlet or a RESTful web service. In the method doGet, I would just invoke my EGBs or CDI or whatever, and just access this from outside to access your application server from the outside world. Now you can argue, okay, but then I have to deploy my testing servlet to bundle the testing servlet, with the real application, which is not true. You can create a testing war, which includes the other war as a jar. There's a hack to do this. So there is in war plugin, there's a setting, something like attach classes, and what Maven will do will deploy this war and jar to a repository. It is reusable across other wars. Okay, so the idea being you have a dedicated war with a single servlet, which points to your production war, and you can so introduce your own testing API without changing the origin setting of the war. Everyone agreed? No questions. What's wrong with you? So I get asked all over the place. Testing. Now we are here. Everything is obvious. Torture testing. Actually, I only knew the term stress testing, and I look at Wikipedia, and they are talking about torture testing, which is a lot nicer. I like it more than stress testing. So from then, I will use the term torture testing. In my eyes, the most important test is torture test. If you're thinking about this, the all QA department and we are together crazy, right? Because why? We're talking about unit tests, integration tests. And if you look what happens behind the scenes, there's a single thread running and accessing our either POJOs directly, which doesn't make any sense in Java environment, or my system tests will access a single-threaded deployed application server. It doesn't make any sense because from day one, your application server, your application will run in single-threaded, in multi-threaded environment concurrently. And it's actually never tested. So what I would say is the torture testing is the most important thing of application. Why? What it means, you are just generating the load, and this load doesn't have to make sense. You just generate the load, whatever, right? And see what your application server is doing, how much memory the application consumes, how much session you are able to open until it cracks, whether you have memory leaks or not, what actually happens behind the scenes. Funny story, it is never done, at least in Germany not. There's no budget, no one knows about this. What is often done is called load testing, which I don't care about. I don't care about load testing. Why? Because load testing is reasonable through the eyes of the domain experts. And if you're creating an application with load tests, what you will find within the load test, sleep times, like the user clicks and waits for 1 second. So if you're building such a script, there will be zero concurrency. Each sleep statement decreases the chances that 2 threads will hit the same component. Okay? So I don't care about load testing at all. What I do, I start with very trivial tests like login page and just denial of service, launch a denial of service attack with JMeter to access the login page. Surprisingly, some of the applications don't even survive the login page. So a customer asked me to torture test the application. It was basic, get request to the page with JMeter or AB, Apache benchmark. So it comes out of the box with any Linux, Unix-based machine. And what the developer did was a portal application. In the login page, the developer started a new thread. New thread start, which killed completely everything. So in 5 minutes, I was able to go home because I was not able to log in. It was never tested. Multi-year project, So, torture testing. Why are you using this? To determine breaking points or safe usage limits. For instance, endless questions. Should the application be stateless or stateful? And does state scale? So you can spend 2 days in meetings, argue about this without any outcome because no one knows this. Or you can start a torture test and start as many HTTP sessions, somehow realistic sessions, so just open and open sessions and see what the application server does. What you will find out that the HTTP session is surprisingly small. So if you ask the question in meetings, how many sessions can your server handle? The answers I get back like 300 or something, which is absolutely not true. I launched a test with Glassfish for 100K. This is the story. And I was on a project with 4-way clusters in a company with 300 employees, and the architect was concerned about scaling. So, okay, what happens, you know, we have 4 nodes, is it enough? He said, look, we can handle 500,000 sessions. We have 300 employees. It's more than enough, believe me. No, but we go stateless, and stateless is the way to go, and probably we can use some Node.js in the backend. So, yeah, but I mean, believe me, the next 100 years should be enough, right? So, torture testing. So, if someone asks stateful, stateless, proof of concept, torture test, come back with the numbers, talk about this. Or, you know, see which application server is fast or slow. It's very easy. Then you can use Archillion, whatever, just to quickly deploy your application to different application servers, run a torture test, and see what happens. And by the way, if there are no resources, the best hackers which torture test the application are students. Imagine a student gets a job. Here are the load generators. Try to break our server. It's the best job ever. You don't need highly paid consultants to do this. Our students are more than sufficient. To confirm intended specification are being met, yeah. For instance, I think it's called stay-away test. I don't even know, where you can increase every few minutes the amount of users and see when the application server breaks. And also, what's interesting, what we would like to use, this is a really nice input for throttling. For instance, the main reason why we use EJBs is for throttling. We can set the max pool size. What you can do with this, see when the application server breaks, then subtract minus 20%, and this is the setting for all the pools, for instance. Thread pools, JDBC pools, and whatever. Okay? It's really never done. It's crazy. To determine modes of failure. How exactly system fails? This is really from Wikipedia, but this is really great. What I, for instance, always do, if I have a new server, I did it with Tommy, with Whitefly, and in the beginning with Glassfish. First, I launch a stress test or torture test, and then I try to misconfigure the application server. For instance, what happens if I have 100 users and just 5 JDBC connections? And I would like to find the errors in the log files, how it looks like, before we go in production. Most of the application operations don't even know how the errors look like. What happens with the incoming queue is full. It's very easy to test with torture test. It's actually never done in production. Okay? So then really try to misconfigure application server and watch for the output in log files. If there is no output in log files, it's a very bad sign. Then you have to do something about this. Okay? And this is, I think, the beginning of the clouds. Agreed? Because only then you can auto-scale, be elastic, or whatever. Or you can then use all the buzzwords. If you don't know this, you cannot just launch a new instance, because you have no idea what the application server is doing. Any questions about this?
Yeah, if you want to get reasonable numbers that mean something to people, numbers of concurrent users, your systems can support things like that, don't you need something that looks like real users?
Yeah, but this is usually, I have almost in all larger projects, I had no influence on this because it was defined by someone else who just did load testing. So there was expensive tools like from HP, it's called the load runner and stuff like this, and there was a whole department just writing the scripts. And for me, it was really hard to influence them. Instead of this, what we did usually, it was I would say undercover action. Like the whole night, we misused Jenkins to start JMeter without the UI, and to denial of service our server and see what happens. And this is why I started the project Lightfish. It is still, you can still use it to monitor from outside what the Glassfish does and records all the stuff in a database. And I will migrate it to the other application servers as well. But this was the basic idea, to run the load tests the whole night, and our goal was to survive the night. And it will never happen at the beginning. You will see whatever you're doing, it will break after a few hours because something is misconfigured. JVM or application server, whatever. And realistic, so what I try to do, I try to increase the probability that I will actually find the error. This is just the purpose. And then, of course, I would like to see how the application server behaves. For instance, right now, I performed some torture tests with Whitefly and was surprised that actually the whole stack looks differently than Glassfish. So there is performance is similar, but the overhead is different on different components. This is what you can really easily learn, where the performance is spent. Or last week I got the question, CDI does a lot of bytecode manipulation. Doesn't it hit the performance? I could say immediately, no, I never saw it in the stack. That actually this consumes a lot of power. What I usually will see in stack, HTTP stack, is like, servlet consumes 80% of the time and EGB don't even appear. But no one talks about servlets are slow. Yeah, I was like, oh, EGBs are too slow, which is also nice. Cargo cult. Agreed? You get a T-shirt, but this is harder. It's medium.
Yeah, I still would say, because I worked supporting e-commerce apps for a bit. You get some really interesting modes of failure that only happen with
Real.
real users.
Yeah, my reel is probably different. If I see a contention point, for instance, you are the developer. You see probably an entity which is hit by read and write threads at the same time with optimistic locking. I would try to generate load there and see what happens with optimistic locks. For instance, this is not realistic because I have no idea how many users will meet in exactly this point, but I know from the application design this is the critical point. And what can happen, for instance, if we do this, we saw that in a cluster environment, if you do this, for instance, you have to invalidate the cache sometimes because you get optimistic lock exceptions all over the place, or deactivate the cache and do something about this. This is my semi-realistic test, because what I try to find the hotspots and exaggerate, and load testing is like what the users are doing regardless whether it is a hotspot or not. So, and what I saw a lot in my projects, load tests were fine, but the application didn't work, really. So, this is some of my contracts. I forgot to introduce myself. I'm a freelancer from 1997, and I have lots of how it's called task forces where we try to improve things which went wrong. And usually there was load test, everything was in place, but the load test was like, I also don't know about timing here, but Germany is like, 2 days before going live, stress test, load test is started, and everyone expects green. And this is a crazy talk. What I would like, I would expect red, fail first, this time, and then improve, right? Yeah, and stable operation. For instance, right now I'm using Docker. What was interesting, what is the performance overhead and whether it works or not, and it was immediately, I run the application on native Linux and then on Docker and restarted the tests, and the performance was absolutely okay. So there's actually almost no difference. Well, Docker is like virtualization, but lighter. Okay, different topic. And load testing is out of scope of my project because it's usually performed by different departments. And you get oft recording tools where the users are emulated, regardless whether it is a critical point of application or not. Okay? By the way, from the whole Jenkins and continuous integration pipeline, what you're usually doing, how it's called continuous deployment should happen. I mean, if you automate everything, you get continuous deployment. And the last successful check-in of the day is checked out by the stress tests at 10 a.m. So the stress test is the only timed job, scheduled job. All other jobs are on commit or on push, and the stress test runs at night. So let's say it starts at 10 p.m. It checks out the application, the tag, the last successful tested part, and runs the test the whole night until the application server breaks. And in the morning, we see the results, and we can say, okay, what was the most expensive SQL statement or whatever, and then define the actions. Okay? This is how it works. And because we never, or we seldom get a dedicated application server, we misuse Jenkins for this. So we use on Jenkins for the night, in process, we're starting JMeter or even multiple JMeter instances if Jenkins is powerful enough. Functional testing. This is, I think, this is, I hope I'm right. So sometimes you will have to test the page from outside, and I would call it functional testing. It's like Selenium tests, for me, or web tests are functional testing. And this is not used a lot because the developers have to maintain the tests, and this is, seems to be expensive. But I have to say I do it all the time in enterprise applications and not so much in internet applications. And the reason for that is enterprise applications are more or less JSF workflows. So there are JSF wizards, like you have you have a page flow of 10 pages. And if you develop the application, and you say, and you are developing the 10th page, you will have to click at least 9 times until you arrive on the last page. And you can automate this with such tests. So the test will open a browser and automatically go to the last page and then input some things. So I actually save time with this. You have to be careful. You cannot test whether the layout is okay or something like this. You can crazy. But what you can do, you can use CSS selectors or IDs, something which is stable, and this works often good. So what I did, it wouldn't be possible without functional testing. I helped to build the JavaEE 6 Vaadin integrations a few years ago, and the problem with this, I had to build a CDI scope. And a scope is a little bit harder to build because what I expect it to be is there's one browser tab opens one scope. So what I did, I remote control the browser and say new tab, and just counted the instances inside, whether it actually works or not. Without functional testing, I'm pretty sure it wouldn't be even possible to develop such an application in that time. Okay, what I use for this, Archillion. Great tool, Archillion with Graphene extension. It's called Graphene. So what Graphene is a very lean wrapper around Selenium or WebDriver. And you can very easily open browsers, push buttons, input text to text fields and stuff like this. And you can even decide whether you are remote controlling the browser without even having the server, or you can deploy the application first on the server and then launch the browser. Okay? So what it actually means, you can use Archillion with Graphene to test applications which are not even written in Java and have nothing to do with JavaEE. Okay? And acceptance testing is, in one project, whether the application actually can be used. What we did, the client hired some users to test the application. So it's a little bit out of scope. And this was end of the slides, which is always good. And now I would like to show you some code, which is even better. But I think slides were important because otherwise I would get still the same question, no, what about unit testing, whatever. So I would like to start with Archillion and Graphene. So any questions, by the way? Perfect.
I have a question, getting slightly back to endurance testing and stress testing. Do you actually use endurance testing? Compared to usual stress testing, it's running almost under maximum load, say 80–90% of the load. But running it for long periods of time, say 24 hours, for example, just to figure out what happens inside the application.
This would be the best, but I have a hard time to introduce stress testing at all, I have to say. And I know this is a totally different story, but it doesn't have to be JavaEE. I create a project, it's called Afterburner for JavaFX, and I know they are testing this all over the time. They found some memory leaks, so it runs the whole time. But it's not my project, someone uses this and in place. And what you mentioned is great, 80% CPU utilization, something like this. And what's funny, it is often very hard to achieve it with application servers. To achieve the 80% utilization, it turns out what the application is doing is waiting for I/O from the database. If you don't have any, algorithms, complex algorithms, it's really hard to achieve your 80% utilization, and your database will go down, and the application server still has nothing to do. So that's also interesting. But what you are experimenting is perfect, and what you also should do is, if you have time, really the best. So I'm talking about the first 30%, I would say, to increase the load until 90%, and then under 80, and see whether the application server is able to retire. For instance, what we found on an application server, which commercial one, which you did this, the application server created, put some transactions in the queue, I have to just remember, and then because of timeout, it had to cancel the transactions with another transaction, and the outcome was the CPU went to 500% or whatever, because we had multiple cores, and the application server created more and more transactions without any user input. It was a bug of the application server. So it's really interesting, to increase the load above the threshold, then under the threshold, and see whether the application server actually retires. So this will be the best, and we do it in the task forces, but as regular test, the customer don't even, understand what we are doing. If you're building products, I will always do this. In project, it's harder to argue. Okay, very good. It's called endurance test. Didn't even knew it. Okay, but SOA. Soap, you don't have to test it. It never works. Always right. Not just kidding.
Saying soak.
Soak.
As in drenching it with water.
Oh, so sorry. I think SOAP testing. Like you don't have to test it. Just read and just kidding. So this is Selenium WebDriver test, and the simplest possible. So you can inject the WebDriver, which can be the browser, and you can usually choose whether it's Firefox, Chrome, or PhantomJS, which is embedded one, which runs perfectly on Jenkins. PhantomJS is like wrapped. What is the engine behind Safari? WebKit. It's wrapped WebKit, which runs headless on the server. And now I'm injecting a web element, which is anything with tag name h3, which is the h3 tag. And now I can test whether the whitefly is actually up and running. Page get title contains whitefly, and so I will have to start at first, otherwise it will fail. What's more important is, or interesting, what's about the POM. And the POM is not that bad as it was. So I have one dependency on Archillion. This is an Archillion test. And I see I'm using the Archillion JUnit container. So what it actually means, I have to run Archillion as a decorator of the test. So it runs actually the test, it executes the test. And the Graphene is the wrapper of Selenium and WebDriver. And you see here Graphene WebDriver, and anything else is Hemcrest and JUnit is just 60 lines of XML. And this is what we did a lot, to smoke test the application. Is this application even up, for instance? It's very easy. And this is what I always would use Archillion, because the API is even simpler than stock Selenium and WebDriver. It's far less code, because this is a more accessible, a nicer API to Selenium and WebDriver. So go for Archillion for this. But this is usually not what I'm asked for. So what they expected for me to launch application server with Archillion, this is what I try to avoid. You got a point? Questions about this? No questions. I don't know whether it's a good sign or a bad sign. So this is the archetype what I created. So you can download it. The airhex is the group ID. I had to use, in order to submit open source project to a Sonatype, you have to have working URI. It cannot be imaginary. And I think the most neutral one I have is airhex. And the other one would be AdamBean. So I used airhex. This is actually the story behind this. And just go to junk and say testing. So, and what it does, hopefully it doesn't check the internet right now, it will create the project testing, and this is a ready-to-use application which actually comes with some RESTful stuff, very simple, but let's concentrate on testing. So I try to implement some tests and discuss the test with you. So first, registrations. There is a class registrations, which happens to be an EJB. You see, EJB means it's stateless. And what I did, I injected a FAT calculator, which is a POJO. So it's a made-up application that just created something to have a little bit of business logic. And I also used here the entity manager, which is absolutely okay. So don't use DAO, it's a different topic, so it's just sufficient. And something strange, I used a tracer. And the tracer uses constructor injection to get a reference to a logger. So, and how to test this? Control-Shift-T in IntelliJ and NetBeans, and for Eclipse, you really need a specific plugin to move between classes and test classes. So I just create registration just with new, because it's a POJO. Then I mock out the FAT calculator. In fact, on Tuesday, I had a talk about JavaEE design, and I say, forget about interfaces, they are not needed. And someone really asked, yeah, without interfaces, we cannot test that. We cannot write mocks. And this is actually, of course you can, for several years already. So this FAT calculator is just a class. And with mockito.mock, you can mock out the class. What means mock out the class? You get an instance back, and the instance can be manipulated. This is a mock. So the behavior can be recorded after the fact. I also mock out the entity manager because I don't care, and I mock out the tracer, and then I see, I don't know, when, oh, this is the recording, when price calculator, calculate total, then return 1, and now I can test whether the registration, the price calculation was okay or not, without even launching the container. And in this example, I wouldn't even understand why I should launch the server. I have no idea why. It couldn't test anything additional. It would just take 10 times longer than my test. I agreed with this. Interfaces, don't care about interfaces for testing, even better without interfaces. And for design, forget them completely. Only use interfaces if you would like to implement strategy pattern. For anything else in JavaEE, they are superfluous. And so, this is the first test. Registration test. Then FAT calculation test, even easier. No dependency injection is a CDI class, but I mean, who cares? It's just a POJO. I just see whether the FAT is correctly implemented. Got a point? And the entity has some computations. I just create the entity, and this is my integration test for the entity. Unit test for the entity. Just check whether the get method computes what I expect. So, and now the strange story. So what I also have, I try to make up something because it will be too simple. What I created, I'm able here, this is actually a sample from the specification. It's one example what we can do CDI, and this is in the CDI specification. So I reused the example. Logger name, what I did, get member, get the client class, and get name. So I'm using the logger name. And this is passed from the injection point. So this is actually the part of the application where the logger gets injected. Logger, get logger, logger name. And in my logger exposer integration test, this is a full-featured Archillion test. And what it does, what it's doing, now I hope I can explain you what is the killer feature of Archillion. The killer feature of Archillion is I can inject the logger into logger injection support class. And now the feature is this class resides in source-java. So it will be never ever deployed in production. So now I can inject to this my logger injection support test class, my logger, expose it again, and my tests tries to see whether the logger is properly configured or not. In my eyes, this is not possible without Archillion. If you wouldn't use Archillion, you had to deploy this class to your business code, source main Java, and had some switch in production to test, to activate your class and not your class. And the problem is then you need qualifiers, and you need a qualifier production and integration test. And I think only with Archillion it is possible to create test support classes and store the classes, the mocks. Store the mocks in source-java, and they are loaded by Archillion. And this is the absolute killer feature for Archillion. This is where you cannot work without Archillion. You got a point? Because if I would, you got it or not? If I would unit test this, I will have to mock out the injection point, which is just an interface. If I will mock out this, it will always work. Because then I will return my member, whatever, and I know what I'm expecting, so it will always work. The more interesting point is, if I'm using this, is the application server correctly computing? Is the member actually the member? Is it the fully qualified class name or something else, for instance? Okay? The same use cases with plugins. What plugins means, I'm injecting an interface, and I expect either multiple implementations, no implementation, or one. Only with Archillion, I can create multiple deployment units. One unit without any plugins, one unit with multiple plugins, and one unit with a single plugin. Without Archillion, impossible, or is possible. You need branches, and per branch, Jenkins, you can forget it completely. Interestingly, for such cases, Archillion is never used. So what I cannot get, for instance, for my Vaadin project, what I did, I created erroneous wars with 2 root URIs and try to identify whether a particular exception happens. Without Archillion, it wouldn't be possible. What I see instead, the most asked question for Archillion is how to load everything to a war. It's like, why do you need Archillion then? Just deploy this to the application server is the same effect. Agreed? What I forgot to implement, but it is can be easily fixed, is the integration test for the entity. And oh, by the way, you see some classes end with IT, and some classes end with test. This is the natural separation of Maven. Everything which ends with test is going to be executed by Surefire plugin, and everything which ends with IT by the failsafe plugin, which is critical to me because then all tests which are fast, which are per definition unit tests, are executed first, and I get immediate feedback, and I have multiple jobs on a Jenkins pipeline, the first node is my test, unit tests. If they pass, I get, I forgot what is the name, the next job, and there are integration tests. If they pass, the application server is going to be created, the application server is going to be, the application is going to be deployed, and the next point are system tests. Okay? So, and Maven shouldn't be monolithic. So what it means, it should just, Maven clean install should just execute the unit tests. And for the composition, this is the job of Jenkins. What I see often, you know, the embedded containers, embedded Glassfish, everything in Maven, there's a huge Maven thing. If you say Maven clean install, everything happens in my build, and the same happens on a Jenkins. I don't get it. Questions? By the way, the POM here is extremely simple. So this is with Archillion, still 60 lines of code. And you can download it from GitHub. It's in my account. So I created it before the show. I think I checked it yesterday or something. So we have, no, it was in junk folder. Testing, this is what we created right now. So Maven clean install will build the application and test it. So this will all tests will run. And Maven failsafe integration tests, which happens in the ADE or on Jenkins, will just perform the integration tests. So now it run Weld, because I just needed Weld to test this, started Weld, checked the dependency injection, and now unit tests were executed first, integration tests, then exactly how it was defined in Wikipedia. Okay? And this is, if you can find an article in Wikipedia on any standard, it's great, because you can shorten the meetings. It's like, look, unit test first, integration test then, how defined, questions are over. Okay? Meetings are boring, so really. I spent, I don't know, for one year of my life in meetings without any outcome. It's like, okay, questions about this?
Not really about this type of question. It comes to the Archillion. So Archillion every time creates a shrink wrap. Have we ever encountered a situation when we get firm gen out of memory due to the memory leaks? Because, for example, when you have a bunch of sweet tests of Archillion, it usually happens to create memory leaks. Because every time the deployment is refreshed,
We probably know, and the reason is probably because it runs on Jenkins, and it runs, and then if it's successful, probably is my project too small, or I don't use so much Archillion as I tried. You know, it's not like all my projects are built on top of plugins and stuff like this. But to one line of code, and then I'm happy. Then you can ask me questions. So no, it was registration tests. What I need is registration IT. Is registration integration tests for the JPA entity. And what I would do is init before. So, and how my persistence text looks always is persistence, create entity manager factory with the name IT, and create entity manager. And this is my entity manager. And what I also need is this get transaction, and I got the entity transaction back. This TX. No, sorry. So, and this is my setup. And this is my integration for the entity, and the very simple test I would start with, I call it often CRUD. CRUD, because what I only would be something like this. This TX begin. This with one semicolon, of course, commit. This merge, new registration. So, and now the application server is forced to check whether it is mappable to the database. You know, all my named queries are parsed and stuff like this. So this is the minimum per entity. Very simple one. And of course, what you can also do somewhere else is persistence. Create entity manager factory, I think. Was it here? Generate schema. So it can even say generate schema up front. So it is new in Java 7, also useful. But this is my integration test per entity. And of course, if I have more complex queries, they are tested also here, named queries. Each complex named query is tested here, usually with embedded databases. So any other questions? I don't have t-shirts, but I can give you some stickers right now. So ask the question. Yeah.
Sometimes we have composed primary keys,
Uh-huh.
and embedded databases are not able to auto-increment this kind of...
Derby? Increment. What I found out, Derby is the most compatible one. So Derby is incredibly powerful. Hypersonic is faster than Derby. And if embedded databases do not work, or if your schema becomes too complex, what I did in the past, VirtualBox or VMware image with fully virtualized database and operating system, and after the test, I rolled back the whole snapshot. So I always had a clean starting point, always the same. And now I'm doing the same with Docker, even faster. And the great story is, for VirtualBox, there is a Java API and Maven API. We are the same, and Docker comes even with REST API, so you can fully automate this. This is what so if it works, I mean, then okay, embedded. If it becomes too complex, use the real database with real data, which is virtualized. If it doesn't work because the database is too large, so you have to build an application which extracts some data from the application. Very good. Time is up. So hopefully it was not too obvious. From my eyes, it's very obvious. So if you just look at definition and what you can do in Java is obvious. For unknown reason, it never happens that way in JavaEE. And developers try now to launch the application server to test it to string methods, which I never understood and are completely confused. If you see the same way, I'm satisfied that I'm not crazy, and I will back to my project and do exactly the same tomorrow. So thank you, and see you in the next conference.